A very complicated story, and as soon as you put one version out, there's surely going to be 4 more to contradict you, but here goes. When we first began the discussions 2 years ago that led to today's event, we weren't in recession, and there was no talk of a serious economic downturn, and we weren't in the political crisis that we're at the scale of political crisis that we see today. At that time, what motivated the stories of that conversation was a serious concern about the nature of the relationship between the community sector and the state, the way in which the state, and specifically how it used funding to control dissent, to choke critique, and to kind of mediate our engagement. We didn't have a strategic plan, an evaluation framework, we didn't have a funding strategy, we didn't have a communication strategy, we didn't have a marketing strategy, and believe it, we didn't have a performance management system. No, we were just having a group of people who were having a conversation. And these individuals, I suppose, were expressing the growing discontent and frustration with the way things are. We didn't even have a name, and I think we were affectionately, a group of us affectionately called the Gunpowder Club, and then we became Isféidir Ling, thanks to Sheila Simmons over there. And I think it was just an informal grouping. And like the TV license ad says, we had heard all the excuses and none of them worked. And as we began to, I suppose, feel that there is a need, and this conversation was happening, I know, in many other spaces, a need for a different analysis and a different way of looking at the world. We believe that there's something fundamentally wrong with the society where individuals, communities, entire sectors are pitched in competition with each other. You know, where members of society are defined merely as consumers or as clients or as beneficiaries. Where participants are not as participants in and agents for change. A society that's watched over the grossly, I suppose, unequal division of resources, power and wealth. A silence where individuals are increasingly isolated within a world of consumerism, and where communities are increasingly sidelined, are hammered, are feel under siege and ignored. And where many of us have felt the heavy hand of the state when we dare to criticise or to take a stand. And even where many of us, unfortunately, are question whether or not we can act and learn from even the Ryan report, that we have that capacity in the society to do that. About 18 months ago, in a parallel related process, the community platform began the process and commissioned a report called A Better Ireland is Possible, which is an excellent analysis of our economic model of development written by Peadar Kirby and Mary Murphy. I should also say that the grouping that became Isféidir Ling also commissioned Brian Harvey to write a report on the way funding, I suppose, mediates the relationship, and we had a report and conference last year called No Strings Attached, and I think many of you would have been at that here. I think the idea of a better Ireland is on the face of it a pretty straightforward concept. I don't think you'd get too many people disagreeing with that idea of a better and a good society. But of course we all know that language matters and that words mean many different things depending on who's using them. I think that's very obvious when you hear, I think, across the political spectrum, every political party talking about fairness, inclusivity, equality even. So we set about, in Isféidir Ling, we set about trying to, I suppose, put words on what we meant by what an inclusive, equal, sustainable society might actually look like. And this we will look at in more detail later on. Mary's going to present that, I suppose, the outcome of that piece of work to you today. There is a palpable pulse of change in the air, I think you'd all agree. And I'm sure many of you were at the recent SIP2 protest organised against the cuts in community services, which was attended by thousands of people, and I think it was an amazing event. I think at the recent co-op conference, CWC conference held last week, the anger expressed at the cuts and the way in which the poorest communities and most disadvantaged communities in our society are being sidelined and hammered was loudly articulated. And there are other spaces and places where people are gathering and taking action. And today is just a contribution to that growing momentum and growing movement and force for change. While there are obvious, I suppose, places and spaces within the community sector where we come together and talk about issues, it's less clear where that wider civil society space is. And I believe that the timing is right to realise the possibility of that wider civil society movement. A civil society that is inclusive of the community sector, the trade union movement, political activists, academics, media, interested individuals, committed individuals in the private sector. I know there's one or two of them here today. People interested and committed people in the public sector. A strong civil society is key to that idea of progressive politics. A politics that is concerned with governance, democracy, real social democracy. A politics that transcends narrow, self-interested political boundaries. A politics that speaks to and on behalf of a society that is diverse, is complex, and is intelligent. And a politics that's far more ambitious than the current preoccupation with chasing percentage points on the economic growth charts. You might say that's fighting talk, but why not? We've clearly arrived at a moment. The recession is a turning point, one way or the other, and we need to shape what that turning point looks like. It should be possible to articulate a vision for what a more inclusive society is, how we want to live together, how we want to be together. And I suppose most crucially, what we actually stand for. And it was, I think, captured very well in what Edison said when he said that restlessness and discontent is the essence of progress. These conversations are happening in many different places. They're happening in different countries in many different ways. People are beginning to demand real and tangible change, like, for example, minimum and maximum wages. The idea of a maximum wage, I think, is probably pretty obvious but pretty radical. Levels of taxation that are consistent with the delivery and organisation of really good quality public services. Changes to the culture of greed, of individualism and competition that prevails. I think achieving the goal of a more progressive and equal society, it requires some risk-taking. And I think today is a risk, and we would absolutely be upfront and say that this is not owned by any one small group of people, that we are actually trying to take a risk and putting something and putting an idea out there. It's about the sharing of knowledge. It's about communication and cooperation and collective action. We need to make sure that the very communities who are actually struggling in the face of and experiencing the direct impact of the savage cuts and the gross levels of inequality and poverty in our society are a key part of how we move forward and the actions that we take. We also need to avoid the impulse or the inclination to overly formalise and overly structure every initiative and every grouping. And I personally actually find that really hard, and as many people know, I always like to start defining structures pretty quickly. And I think really it's probably a product of years of trying to prove ourselves that we can be taken seriously enough. That actually a bit of chaos is no harm, and probably is what's needed at this moment. I suppose within all of that, what I'm really trying to say is the time is here to reimagine how we organise ourselves and how we are as a society going forward. And as I've said, I think there's probably a number of versions or, tweakings of the journey of how we got here today. But I hope I've given you some sense of, where we've come from, what our motives are, what the ambition is. And I think, it was gathering around that idea of the good society. And today really for us and for me is an opportunity to create a space where everybody can be part of that discussion and redefine collectively the way forward.